The day I buried my husband, my mother whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Every man who gets close to her ends up miserable." Several heads turned. Nobody defended me, not even my father. I stood beside the fresh grave with dirt still clinging to my black shoes, holding the folded flag the funeral director had placed in my trembling hands. The late afternoon wind carried the smell of rain, but I couldn't feel anything except the crushing weight inside my chest. My husband, Ethan, had been alive 4 days earlier. 4 days. Now I was 29 years old, a widow, and somehow the villain in my own family's story. Mom crossed her arms dramatically. First your grandparents died after babysitting you. Then your fiancé left years ago. Now your husband is gone. You bring nothing but tragedy. The words should have hurt. Instead, they exhausted me. Because I had heard them my entire life. Whenever something terrible happened, somehow it became my fault. If Dad lost his job, I had distracted him that morning. If Mom got sick, I had stressed her. When my younger brother crashed his first car while texting, Mom insisted I should have stopped him from leaving. Eventually they stopped calling me Evelyn. At home they simply called me, Bad Luck. I believed them longer than I care to admit. Until Ethan, he laughed the first time I confessed it. Evelyn, he said while pulling me into his arms, people who love you don't invent curses to explain their own failures. I cried that night because nobody had ever spoken to me that way. He spent 4 years patiently undoing damage my parents had spent decades creating. Every morning he kissed my forehead before work. Every evening he asked about my day as though the answer genuinely mattered. When I apologized for things that weren't my fault, he gently corrected me. You don't have to carry everyone's mistakes. I almost learned how. Then a drunk driver ignored a red light. One careless decision stole my entire future. The funeral blurred together. Flowers, condolences, empty promises that people disappear after a week. My parents never once asked how I was surviving. Instead they criticized everything. Mom complained my dress looked too expensive. Dad muttered that Ethan's family seemed cold because they weren't crying loudly enough. They even argued over who should drive home. Standing a few feet away was the only person who hadn't spoken since the service began. Arthur Whitmore, Ethan's godfather. He wasn't related by blood, but everyone knew he had raised Ethan after his parents died when he was 12. Arthur was in his late 60s, tall despite his age, silver-haired, wearing a dark suit that somehow looked sharper than everyone else's despite the rain beginning to fall. He watched everything. He said nothing. Before leaving the cemetery, he approached me. His voice was soft. Come by the house tomorrow morning. I nodded weakly. I don't think I can. You can. Something about the certainty in his voice made me believe him. I'll send a car. Then he walked away. My parents immediately exchanged suspicious looks. What did the old man want? Mom demanded. I don't know. You'd better not embarrass this family begging for money. I stared at her. My husband was buried 20 minutes ago. She shrugged. I'm just warning you. That was my mother. Even grief had to wait until after accusations. The next morning a black sedan arrived exactly at 9. Mom followed me outside. If he's giving away anything valuable, remember your family comes first. I looked at her for several long seconds. Not once had she asked whether I had slept, whether I had eaten, whether I wanted company, only whether I might receive something worth taking. Arthur's estate overlooked a quiet lake outside the city. I'd been there before with Ethan, mostly for Christmas dinners. The place felt different now. Too quiet. Arthur welcomed me himself. No servants, no assistants, just him. He guided me into his library where photographs of Ethan filled an entire wall. A smiling 8-year-old holding a fishing rod. A teenage graduation portrait. Our wedding picture. Arthur noticed me looking. He was my son in every way except biology. I know. He poured tea neither of us touched. Then he asked something unexpected. How much do you know about Ethan's business interests? I frowned. He worked as an architect. He did. Arthur slid a folder across the table. But he also owned 28% of Whitmore Development. I blinked. What? He never told you because he wanted people to value him for who he was, not for inherited wealth. I opened the folder with shaking hands. Numbers, legal documents, company reports, assets, properties. My breathing became uneven. This can't be real. It is. I don't understand. Ethan inherited shares years ago. They now pass to you. I stared silently. Arthur folded his hands. Which means, as of yesterday, you became one of the company's principal owners. The room suddenly felt much smaller. I've never run a company. You won't be alone. Why are you telling me now? Because, he said quietly, your husband trusted you more than anyone. Tears finally escaped. Arthur allowed the silence. Then he asked another question. Does your family know about any of this? No. Good. His expression hardened for the first time. They will. The certainty unsettled me. Sure enough, less than 2 hours after I returned home, Mom burst into my apartment without knocking. She was smiling. My mother only smiled when she wanted something. I heard Arthur invited you over. Who told you? People talk. She sat on my couch as if she owned it. So, what did the old man give you? Nothing. Liar. Dad walked in behind her. I knew she'd hide it. I looked between them. How did you even get inside? I still have the emergency key. The key Ethan had asked me to collect months ago. I suddenly remembered never doing it. Mom leaned forward. Listen carefully. You're alone now. Managing money is difficult. Your father should handle whatever you've inherited. I haven't inherited anything. Dad laughed. You always were a terrible liar. Then Mom said the sentence that changed something inside me forever. Frankly, Ethan dying might be the only fortunate thing that's ever happened to this family. The apartment became perfectly silent. I felt as though every cruel word they'd spoken throughout my life had gathered into one unbearable moment. Before I could answer, my phone rang. Arthur. I answered immediately. His calm voice carried only one sentence. Turn on the television. Channel 7. I reached for the remote with trembling fingers as my parents watched impatiently. The local business news appeared. A reporter stood outside Whitmore Development headquarters, announcing that an emergency board meeting had been called following the death of principal shareholder Ethan Whitmore. Then the screen displayed a photograph of me beside Ethan at a charity gala. The reporter smiled politely before saying words that made both my parents freeze where they stood. As confirmed this morning, Ethan Whitmore's entire ownership stake has legally transferred to his widow, Evelyn Carter, making her one of the company's largest individual shareholders. Company chairman Arthur Whitmore is expected to introduce Mrs. Carter to the board this afternoon. My mother's face lost every trace of color. Dad slowly turned toward me as though he had never seen me before. And for the first time in my life, neither of them called me bad luck. The silence in my apartment stretched so long that I could hear the television anchor moving on to another story. My parents never noticed. Their eyes remained locked on me, calculating, stunned, almost frightened. Mom recovered first. Oh, sweetheart, I almost laughed. She hadn't called me sweetheart in over 15 years. She rushed across the room, grabbed both my hands, and squeezed them so tightly they hurt. We've all been under so much stress. Your father's worried, I've been grieving too. Maybe we've said things we didn't mean. I slowly pulled my hands away. No, I replied quietly. You meant every word. Dad forced an awkward smile. Families argue. That's normal. You called me cursed yesterday. You misunderstood. I've understood perfectly my entire life. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say. Then Mom's eyes wandered around my apartment. This place is too small for someone in your position now. You should move back home until everything settles. Back home. The same house where every broken plate, unpaid bill, failed relationship, and ruined holiday had somehow become my fault. I think I'll stay here. Dad cleared his throat. You'll need financial guidance. I'm meeting attorneys. You don't know if they're trustworthy. They worked for Ethan. He couldn't argue with that. Instead, Mom suddenly wrapped her arms around me. It felt unnatural, like a stranger pretending to be my mother. We're proud of you, she whispered. Those 4 words should have healed something inside me. Instead they made me realize how completely empty they were. Because they hadn't become proud after seeing my strength. They'd become proud after hearing a dollar amount. The moment they finally left, I locked the door, slid down against it, and cried until there were no tears left. Not because I missed their affection. Because I finally accepted I'd never actually had it. Arthur's headquarters occupied the top 20 floors of the tallest building downtown. Walking into the lobby the next afternoon felt surreal. Employees whispered politely. Some offered condolences. Others simply nodded with quiet respect. Nobody stared with pity. Arthur greeted me himself. You look tired. I didn't sleep. I didn't expect you would. He escorted me into the executive boardroom. 10 people sat around an enormous polished table. Expensive suits. Sharp eyes. Years of experience. Every conversation stopped when I entered. Arthur spoke first. This is Evelyn Carter Whitmore. Nobody interrupted. As Ethan's lawful heir, she now assumes his ownership interests immediately. A man near the end of the table adjusted his glasses. I'm Richard Sloan, Chief Financial Officer. Another introduced herself as General Counsel. Others followed. Most were respectful. One wasn't. A silver-haired director named Martin leaned back. With respect, Arthur, she's never managed a corporation. Arthur looked directly at him. Neither had Ethan once. Martin smiled politely. Ethan had years to prepare. Arthur answered without raising his voice. And Evelyn has something equally valuable. What? He has trusted her with everything. No one challenged him after that. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours. I understood perhaps half of the financial discussions. But whenever I admitted I didn't know something, Arthur simply explained it. He never made me feel foolish. On the drive home he said something unexpected. Never pretend to understand what you don't. I felt embarrassed. Good leaders ask questions. I looked out the window. I don't think I'm a leader. You've survived your parents. He smiled faintly. That requires remarkable leadership. Within 48 hours my phone transformed into something almost unrecognizable. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered my birthday. Old classmates wanted coffee. Second cousins invited me to family dinners. Even my Aunt Linda, who once told everyone I would never make a good wife because I was emotionally damaged, called me crying. We've always loved you. I deleted the voicemail. Mom became worse. She began appearing everywhere. Outside my apartment, outside Arthur's office, even outside Ethan's favorite cafe. Always smiling, always carrying food she suddenly insisted on cooking herself. My poor girl shouldn't eat alone. One afternoon she arrived carrying a family photo album. I thought you'd like to remember happier times. I stared at the album. There were hundreds of photographs. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, school graduations. In almost every picture, I was standing slightly apart. Sometimes cropped halfway out, sometimes looking directly at the camera while everyone else laughed together. I'd never noticed before. Mom flipped through pages enthusiastically. See how happy we all were. I gently turned several pages backward, pointing at one picture. Where was I? She blinked. You were sick. Another page. And here, you didn't want to come. Another. And this vacation, you stayed with Grandma. Page after page, memory after memory. Without realizing it, she'd brought proof that I had never really belonged. She quietly closed the album. I suppose we weren't perfect. No, I answered. You weren't. A week after Ethan's funeral, Arthur invited me to dinner. Halfway through the meal he placed a sealed envelope beside my plate. Ethan asked me to give you this if anything ever happened to him. My hands instantly began shaking. I can't. Yes, you can. The letter contained only 2 handwritten pages. My dearest Evie, if you're reading this, then life ignored every promise I begged it to keep. Don't waste years wondering whether you could have saved me. You couldn't, but you can save yourself. Please don't let anyone convince you that you're difficult to love. I've watched your family apologize only when they wanted something. I've watched you forgive them every single time. You deserve people who love you before they need you. Arthur will help if you let him. One more thing. There are truths about your childhood that I discovered accidentally. I couldn't prove them completely. Arthur can. I folded the letter slowly. What truths? Arthur remained silent for several seconds. Then he opened another folder. Inside were copies of bank transfers, medical bills, school records, insurance claims. I frowned. I don't understand. Arthur slid one document toward me. When you were 11, your grandparents left an education fund in your name. I nodded faintly. I remember Mom saying the investment collapsed. It didn't. Another paper appeared. The account was emptied. My stomach tightened. By whom? He met my eyes. Your parents. I stared at him. No, they used every dollar. For what? He handed me another receipt. A sports academy, private coaching, international competitions. Every payment had one name. My younger brother, Daniel. The room seemed to tilt beneath me. They told me there wasn't enough money for college. Arthur nodded slowly. They lied. I covered my mouth. Suddenly dozens of childhood memories rearranged themselves. The scholarships I desperately chased. The part-time jobs. The nights I skipped meals because tuition came first. All while the money meant for my future had quietly funded someone else's dreams. Arthur spoke carefully. I hired investigators. After Ethan mentioned how strangely your family treated you, I whispered, why? Because he loved you. I looked down at the documents scattered across the table. For the first time in my life, I realized something that hurt even more than being called bad luck. My parents hadn't merely blamed me. They had built their entire family's future by stealing mine. And somehow, Arthur's expression told me that the worst revelation was still waiting to be uncovered. I couldn't sleep after leaving Arthur's house. The documents lay across my dining table until sunrise, each page stripping away another illusion I'd carried since childhood. Every receipt, every transfer, every signature belonged to my parents. The education fund my grandparents had promised would guarantee my future had never disappeared. It had simply been redirected to Daniel's ambitions while I worked double shifts, accepted scholarships, and listened to lectures about how life wasn't fair. The cruelest part wasn't the money. It was how easily they had watched me struggle. The next morning Arthur called. I've arranged a meeting. With who? Everyone. What does that mean? Your parents, your brother, the company's attorneys, our accountants, and the executor of your grandparents' estate. My heartbeat quickened. Today, in 45 minutes. The number made me pause. 45 minutes. The same amount of time Arthur had promised would end everything. By the time I reached the conference room, everyone had already arrived. Mom rushed toward me wearing another carefully rehearsed smile. There she is. We were just talking about how proud your grandparents would be. I looked at Arthur. He simply nodded once. The meeting began. Arthur remained standing. I appreciate everyone attending on short notice. Dad frowned. What exactly is this about? Arthur placed several folders on the polished table. It's about truth. The estate attorney spoke next. Years ago, Mr. and Mrs. Eleanor Carter established 2 separate trusts for their grandchildren. Dad shifted uncomfortably. I remember. I'm sure you do. The attorney adjusted his glasses. One belonged to Daniel. He opened the first folder. It was used exactly as intended. Then he opened the second. The other belonged exclusively to Evelyn. Nobody moved. The trust was never legally authorized for withdrawal. Mom's smile disappeared. The attorney continued. However, forged emergency authorization documents were submitted. He pushed copies across the table. Every signature had been analyzed. Every date verified. Every withdrawal traced. Dad's face turned pale. This is a misunderstanding. It isn't, the attorney replied calmly. The signatures were forged. Mom suddenly pointed at me. She's trying to destroy this family. For the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. No, I answered quietly. The truth is, Daniel looked back and forth between our parents. What are they talking about? Dad avoided his eyes. You don't need to hear this. I think I do. Arthur slid another document toward Daniel. Your training, your competitions, your apartment near the academy, your overseas trips. Daniel scanned the pages. We're funded with your sister's inheritance. His face lost all color. What? Mom grabbed his arm. We did it for both of you. Daniel slowly stepped away from her. You told me Grandpa paid for everything. Silence. You lied to me too. For the first time, I saw genuine shock on my brother's face. He hadn't known. He looked at me with tears forming. Evelyn, I swear, I didn't know. I believed him. Because unlike our parents, his pain wasn't calculated. Arthur finally spoke again. There is one final matter. He nodded toward the company's legal counsel. She stood. Mrs. Carter Whitmore has decided not to pursue criminal prosecution. Both of my parents visibly relaxed. Until she continued. However, she opened another file. Civil recovery proceedings have already been filed. Dad blinked. What does that mean? It means every improperly obtained asset purchased using Evelyn's trust must be repaid. The house, subject to review. Our savings, included. The lake cabin, included. Mom slammed both hands onto the table. You can't take everything. Arthur answered before anyone else could. You already did. The room fell silent. There was no shouting after that. No dramatic confession. Only paperwork, evidence, facts. The kind of truth that doesn't need raised voices because documents speak louder. As everyone prepared to leave, Mom turned toward me one last time. You owe us. I almost pitied her. I buried my husband. My voice remained steady. And somehow you still believed this week was about you. She had no answer. Neither did Dad. Daniel stopped beside me at the door. I'm sorry. I know. I can't change what happened. No. A tear rolled down his cheek. But I can spend the rest of my life making sure it never happens again. I hugged him. Not because everything was forgiven. Because he had chosen honesty over comfort. That was enough for a beginning. Months passed. The civil case ended exactly as Arthur predicted. Most of the money could never truly be recovered, but the court ordered substantial repayment through the sale of properties and investments my parents had accumulated using stolen funds. They lost the lake house. They sold their oversized home. Their reputation within the family disappeared even faster. People who had spent years believing I was the difficult daughter finally learned how thoroughly the story had been manipulated. Phone calls arrived almost daily. Apologies, explanations, excuses. I accepted none of them. Not out of bitterness, out of peace. I no longer needed people to rewrite history. I simply walked away from it. With Arthur's guidance, I gradually learned the business Ethan had quietly built. Every meeting became a lesson. Every mistake became experience. Employees who had once looked at me with sympathy began looking at me with confidence. One afternoon, several months later, Arthur invited me to the lakeside bench where Ethan and I used to drink coffee. He smiled gently. "You know why I said I'd end it in 45 minutes? I've wondered. Because lies survive on confusion." He looked across the water. "But once truth enters the room with evidence," he smiled, "lies don't need hours to collapse." I looked at the calm lake reflecting the evening sky. For years I'd believed I was cursed. Then I believed I was broken. After Ethan, I believed I was alone. All three had been lies someone else repeated until I accepted them as my own. Arthur stood and handed me a small wooden box. Inside was Ethan's wedding ring. Beneath it rested a folded note in his familiar handwriting. "Live the life they convinced you that you didn't deserve. Love, Ethan." I slipped the ring onto the chain around my neck beside my own. The grief never disappeared. I don't think real love ever leaves that way. But grief stopped controlling my future. The girl my parents had called bad luck no longer existed. She had been buried beneath years of blame. The woman who walked away from that lake carried something stronger than revenge. She carried the truth, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough.